Where is the... here. Okay. I won't have any pictures except this one to show you, but my PowerPoint files will be used to display the quotations so that you can read them as I comment on them. As you know, Notre Dame de Paris was first published in 1831, and the version we know today dates from 1832. But Victor Hugo had begun work on this novel before the Revolution of 1830, and he left some very interesting drafts and scenarios which provide us with useful information about his first intentions, about what he had in mind at the time regarding the structure of the plot and the system of the characters. In this first version of the novel, the major characters are not the same as in the published version. The three male characters in love with Esmeralda or attracted to her are not Quasimodo, the hunchback, Frollo, the archdeacon, and Phoebus, the soldier, but Quasimodo, Claude Frollo, and Pierre Gringoire, the poet-philosopher. At that time, Phoebus de Chateaupers had not been created yet by Victor Hugo. Therefore, Gringoire initially played a much more important part in the plot than he does in the version we know. But nonetheless, it should be noted that Victor Hugo, that the character of Pierre Gringoire was retained by Victor Hugo in the final version of the novel, even though he could have been removed altogether, since another character had somehow taken his place between the two versions. So today I will talk about Pierre Gringoire, that is to say, about a demoted character. And I'm going to ask myself what this marginal and almost supernumerary character stands for, what he embodies and what he represents in the plot. I will organize my presentation in 3 points. First of all, I will discuss the complicated way in which Gringoire finds his place in the plot or at its margins. Secondly, I will show that this marginal position allows him to embody a certain figure of the poet, a figure that is quite typical of the period, namely that of the whimsical poet. I borrow this expression from an academic named José-Luis Diaz, poète fantaisiste or whimsical poet. And finally, I will propose an ethical and political reading of the character, and I will try to show how Gringoire's marginality allows him to embody the ambiguous desire for a life removed from the tumult of history, from violence, and to represent certain aspects of Victor Hugo's liberalism. That's what I will try to show. So I start with my first part, which is about Gringoire's problematic place in the plot. First of all, it can be noted that without Gringoire, the symbolical structure of the plot would be absolutely clear-cut. We have 3 men, Quasimodo, Frollo, and Phoebus, who are enamored with or attracted to Esmeralda, each of them representing a social power. Quasimodo represents the people, Frollo represents the church, and Phoebus the military and the aristocracy. This structure echoes that of the theater play Hernani, first performed in 1830, in which 3 men, Hernani, Don Carlos, and Don Rigomez, are in love with Doña Sol. This play was originally entitled, in Spanish, it was a Spanish title, Tres para una, 3 for 1. But in Notre Dame de Paris, there is also this 4th male character, namely Gringoire. Gringoire looks set to become a rival to the other 3. At the beginning of the novel, he follows Esmeralda in the streets of Paris, and then captured by the tramps who want to hang him, he is saved by Esmeralda, who agrees to marry him. Thence, once married to her, according to the peculiar custom of the tramps, that is for only 4 years, he intends to consummate his marriage. So Gringoire, too, feels desire for Esmeralda in the first chapters of the novel, and he finds himself married to her. But Gringoire, as the narrator says, is not very sensuous. It's very, That's the structure of my intervention. I should have showed it before. And now here's the quotation. Gringoire is very unsensuous, très peu voluptueux. Indeed, his love for Esmeralda gradually declines, replaced by love for her goat, Djali, then for sculpted portals. And I have another quotation. At first, I was fond of women, then of animals, now of stones. He explains to Frollo far later in the book, when the archdeacon catches him contemplating the sculptures of a chapel. Yes, I haven't read the end of the quotation, but I can do it. They are quite as amusing as women and animals, but much less treacherous. By suggesting that Gringoire might be a lover of Esmeralda and then negating this possibility, the novel seems to underline the supernumerary nature of this character. Expelled from the love plot, Gringoire is also characterized by a certain inability to act. And this is a psychological feature on which the novel insists a lot. The character often lets himself get carried along by events. At the beginning of the novel, he follows Esmeralda in the streets of Paris à tout hasard, which can be translated as at random or randomly, and he comments on his decision by saying, "Why not? Why not?" he said to himself, which indicates a certain lack of psychological motivation. It is also by pure chance that his steps lead him to the Palace of Justice on the very day when Esmeralda and her goat are tried, later in the book. It is true that sometimes Gringoire takes the initiative. The reader, for instance, understands that he is probably the one who urges the tramps to storm the cathedral in order to free Esmeralda. But Gringoire's responsibility in this matter is only hinted at, which is a way of diminishing or erasing his role. And not only doesn't he take part in the tramps' riot, contrary, for example, to Jehan Frollo or Clopin Trouillefou, the king of the tramps, but he often obstructs the action. At the end of the novel, when he and Claude Frollo try to exfiltrate the gypsy girl from the cathedral, his caresses to Djali, to the goat, slow down the escape and, in a certain sense, put the gypsy girl in danger. Gringoire is thus a very paradoxical character who fails to be an agent of the plot in the full sense of the word. But I would like to argue in my second part that this problematic relationship to action can easily be related to Gringoire's status as a poet. If Gringoire, as I will try to show, makes it possible to raise a series of questions relating to the status of the poet and the artist, then this provides him on a symbolic level with a role, with a function, with a density, which he doesn't have on a narrative level. And in many ways, I think that Gringoire can be seen as an image of the poet into which Hugo himself projects, with which Hugo identifies at least in parts. As you probably know, around 1830, Victor Hugo was one of the main leaders, maybe the main leader, of the Romantic movement, which clashed with the classics and their supporters. It is true that Gringoire, from the beginning to the end of the novel, seems characterized by a submission to rules perceived in Hugo's time as associated with classicism. For example, he professes a scrupulous respect for the distinction of registers and genres. In Book 1, at the beginning of the novel, as he tries to have his morality play, The Good Judgment of Madame the Virgin, performed despite the indifference and uproar of the crowd, a character called Gisquette asks him if there will be any bergerette, any pastoral songs in the play. And Gringoire answers, "What, in a morality play? Do not confuse the genre. If it was a sotie, you would have pastoral songs soon enough." The prologue of this morality play, The Good Judgment of Madame the Virgin, the narrator says, is sorry, no, I don't have any quotation for this. I don't have any slide for this quotation. I'm sorry. I just will read it. The prologue of this Moretti play is long-winded and empty of meaning, which is to say that he obeys the rules of the drama. So Gringoire follows the rules. A bit later, we learn that Gringoire is, I quote, fond of lofty and classic comparisons. When he mentally compares a beggar with crutches and a wooden leg in the Court of Miracles to the living tripod of Vulcan. And in the penultimate chapter, he writes a tragedy, which is the classic genre par excellence. It is clear that the failure of the morality play in Book 1 is partly due to the need to respect artificial constraints that are contrary to a true aesthetic taste, which would be, for example, a romantic taste. In this respect, we could be tempted to see Gringoire as a countermodel for Victor Hugo. But at the same time, we do not need to read completely ironically the narrator's compliment to the play. All this was really very beautiful. It was, in truth, a masterly work. Not only does Gringoire, who is not devoid of talent, make the most of the aesthetic codes of his time and of the difficult conditions of performance, which is always interrupted by the crowd and by the Flemish ambassadors when they arrive, and so on, but also the clumsiness, the redundancies, and the real defects of the play are not necessarily exclusive of poetic or dramatic qualities on other levels. It is by no means certain that this sequence in Book 1 should necessarily be seen as a simple polemic charge against classicism, and even less so against Gringoire as a classical poet. This is all the more so because this sequence can also be given a more general significance than that of a simple polemic or satirical intervention in a contemporary literary quarrel. The failure of the good judgment of Madame the Virgin can also be read as a meditation on the conditions for successful theatrical communication. Hugo had recently been faced with the failure of his play Amy Robsart, then with the censorship of Marion Delorme, and then with the tumultuous performances of Hernani in 1830. I do believe that the tumult that prevents the performance of the good judgment can be seen as a reminder of the Battle of Hernani itself, the very turbulent performances of the first performances of Hernani, which of course makes Gringoire's assignment to the pole of classicism infinitely more difficult. Gringoire and Hugo then partly go through the same struggles and the same difficulties as playwrights. Gringoire's literary vocation, however, is only temporarily thwarted. In the course of the book, Gringoire acquires a real talent, if not exactly literary, then at least rhetorical. At the beginning of the novel, he fails to convince Clopin-Trouillefou, the king of the tramps, to spare him the gallows in Book 2. He is only saved in the 11th hour by pure chance, by the providential intervention of Esmeralda, who marries him to save him. But later in the book, he nevertheless manages, aided by circumstances, to mollify the king Louis XI when he risks again being hanged for having been involved in the tramps' riots. This is certainly a paradoxical, unexpected success, which seems to be only partly due to the organization and content of Gringoire's speech to the king, but in the end, the poet manages to save his skin. Rhetorical art, which was inaudible when constrained by the codes of theatrical representation, becomes effective when motivated by urgency. And the noble, stale, worn-out allegories that abounded in the Good Judgment, or the lofty comparison between a beggar and the living tripod of Vulcan, now give way to metaphors like this one. The thunderbolts of God are not hurled against a lattice. This is a grotesque metaphor, no doubt, and a little ridiculous one, but also a striking, visually powerful one. And striking because of the burlesque gap between subject and complement, between the thunderbolts of God and the lettuce. Suddenly, Gringoire emancipates himself, motivated by urgency. He emancipates himself from the rhetorical shackles of classical aesthetics. And in a certain sense, such a sentence is reminiscent of Hugo's own style and of Hugo's own theory of conjunction of the grotesque and the sublime. So far from only being a countermodel, Gringoire also provides a positive image of the poet. This can also be said about his whimsical, eccentric side, which fits perfectly into one of the 5 romantic auctorial scenographies, if you want it in a more simple way, one of the 5 images of the poet, identified by José-Luis Diaz, and namely that of the whimsical poet or ironic poet. Diaz also notes that this posture is constructed by Hugo himself in some of his prefaces. In the 1826 and 1828 prefaces to his poetry collection, Odes et Ballades, then in his preface to the theatre play Cromwell in 1827, and above all, in the preface to the poetry collection Les Orientales, he wrote in February 1829, in which the poet defines himself as, I quote, a man of fantasy and caprice. Now, Gringoire, still according to Diaz, continues this trend, this time within Hugo's fiction. We certainly cannot say that Gringoire is a straight reflection of Hugo, of course, but it is not absurd to think that he embodies a certain facet of him, albeit idealized. Elaborated by Hugo, but also by Balzac and Musset and other writers around 1830, this figure of the whimsical and eccentric poet is characterized by various traits, some of which are found in Gringoire. 2 of these are, first of all, submission to chance and caprice, which makes him follow, for example, a young girl through the streets of Paris at the beginning of the novel. And secondly, flexibility, instability. This character trait prevents Gringoire from settling on a single social identity. A poet by profession, Gringoire embraces a career as a tramp in order not to be hanged when he's captured by the tramp and forced to embrace their career, and then he earns his living as an acrobat and a chair juggler. Symbolically, the figure of the acrobat illustrates this social flexibility. When he carries chairs with his mouth to earn his living, Gringoire makes fun of gravity and in particular of the heaviness of social assignments. Gringoire, therefore, is a remarkably complex figure of the poet. Rather classical, but not completely, he fails in his aesthetic ambitions, but not always, and represents an image of the whimsical, eccentric, unstable, playful artist, typical in some respects of the 1830s. It is not impossible to see in him, to some extent, an ideal version of the poet that Victor Hugo dreams up for himself. Now, I would like to go one step further and move from the aesthetic to the moral and political level. And I will try to show how Gringoire's status as an eccentric poet also allows him to embody some aspects, both desirable and disturbing, of Victor Hugo's liberalism. So, in my third part, let's start by noting that Gringoire is a powerful instrument of comic relief within a serious plot. His interventions, the liveliness of mind he displays, always at least bring a smile to the reader's face. The question is how this whimsical disposition can fit into a world marked by tragic fatality and characterized by serious stakes involving the life and death of the characters. At the end of Hugo's novels, there are always many characters who die, which is an excellent reason to be interested in those who don't, in those who survive. That is to say, those who allow history to go on. And it turns out that Gringoire survives, zigzagging his way through life with characteristic flexibility between the gallows set up for him at every street corner. Gringoire's survival seems to signify the continued possibility of the playfulness and fancy in a tragic regime. Faced with the sublime and/or grotesque characters, such as Esmeralda and Quasimodo, or also the evil archdeacon, Claude Frollo, the mediocre ones seem to be able to thwart the law of fatality, or the law of ananke, as Hugo would say in Greek. It is obviously the case of Phoebus, who survives as well, but it is also the case in some respects of Gringoire, who is also characterized by some moral mediocrity. However, if Phoebus, the superficial idiot, is a despicable character, Gringoire is treated more positively, I believe. I am struck by the fact that many critics find this character morally very reprehensible, especially because of his selfishness, cowardice, and irresponsibility. But the diagnosis of selfishness and cowardice needs to be qualified. The poet-philosopher, for example, is absolutely ready to help Esmeralda when she's under attack. At the beginning of the novel, he boldly steps forward, he boldly advances towards her when she's attacked by Quasimodo, only to realize that her attacker precisely is Quasimodo, which, let's be honest, would certainly have made many people fall back. Gringoire's cowardice, in truth, mainly consists in wanting to avoid the gallows. This is explicitly why he withdraws from the game after his misadventure in the Court of Miracles, after having been recruited by the tramps. This makes him probably less a coward than an average representative of normal mankind attached to life. Neither heroic nor despicable, strangely situated outside the major issues of the novel, Gringoire has at least one endearing aspect. He seems to allow a flight, an escape. He proclaims the reassuring possibility of a place outside the violence of history, that is to say, a place for the average human being. And I would like to relate this to Hugo's liberalism, and here's why. Liberalism is a key term in Victor Hugo's political and aesthetic ideology around 1830. In the preface to Hernani, for example, he states that, I quote, it's a famous quotation, Romanticism is nothing else than liberalism in literature. Romanticism is nothing else than liberalism in literature. This liberalism is, among other things, an individualism. Among its constitutive elements is the defense of the individual's right to privacy against various kinds of encroachment. It can be, for example, the tyrannical encroachment of political power against the rights of love, as in Hernani, where the love between Hernani and Doña Sol is thwarted by the brutality of power. But it can also be, in a more abstract and more general way, the encroachment of history in progress itself on the legitimate tranquility of normal people. And Gringoire's attitude is in many ways a protest for the rights of tranquility, for a right to individual survival, for a right to stay away. And I don't think it's too far-fetched to say that the Hugo of the early 1830s is to some extent tempted, seduced by Gringoire, or by these aspects of Gringoire. But of course, all these must be immediately qualified. The joyful fantasy, with its positive connotations, eventually turns into eccentricity with more troublesome implications. Gringoire's interest in the goat jelly is paralleled with his initial desire for Esmeralda. It is not too far-fetched to see, it's not too far-fetched to see this as a zoophilic desire. This zoophilic desire is not portrayed by the narrator as a perversion or a monstrosity, but as a rather innocent psychological quirk of the character. And it is put on the same level as his love for old carved stones, which are also vaguely eroticized. The fact remains that at the end of the novel, when he has to choose between saving Esmeralda and saving her goat, Jelly, Gringoire chooses to save the goat, and indirectly condemns the gypsy girl to the gallows, without knowing that Frollo will not protect her and so on, but indirectly he condemns the gypsy girl to the gallows. This time, eccentricity leads to irresponsibility. Gringoire survives, but the gypsy girl does not. In the end, eccentricity becomes murderous, and the smile provoked by the character's interventions acquires a grim and worrying touch. This ambivalence of fantasy, which finally turns dark, was probably already marked symbolically in Gringoire's remarkable tendency to lose his balance. For example, he collapses when Claude Frollo comes to interrupt his acrobatics. He falls. Instability, fluidity, suppleness, imbalance imply, on the one hand, freedom and escape, but also, at the same time, fall. To conclude briefly, I would say that the poet-philosopher only problematically acquires a function in the plot. On the other hand, it seems that what makes him central to the economy of the text is that he materializes or embodies the reassuring possibility of escape. Escape from the narrative. He's totally absent from the narrative between Book 2 and Book 9. Escape from the various systems that organize the novel, but also escape from the affective economy of the novel. He's the only one important male character who is not in love with or attracted to Esmeralda, and also escape from moral responsibilities. And since Gringoire is a poet and even embodies a figure of the poet that Hugo elsewhere claims for himself, I am naturally prone to see in him the projection of a desire or of a fantasy of literary irresponsibility, in competition, obviously, with the temptation of the social commitment that already appears in Victor Hugo's poems of this period, and which is, for example, summed up in the last line of the poetry collection Les Feuilles d'Automne, Autumn Leaves, which reads, Et j'ajoute à ma lyre une corde d'airain, and I add to my lyre a string of brass. Both tendencies exist in Hugo, whose liberalism tries to reconcile, especially within fiction, the desire for political intervention and the dream of withdrawal. Escape from moral responsibility, have I just said, or rather, if I return to the episode of Djali's rescue, displacement of moral responsibility. In this episode, Gringoire does rescue someone. He rescues the goat. And in this regard, he does not completely shirk his duty of assistance or altruism, but his criterion for choosing the person to be saved is aberrant, or which amounts to the same thing, to the same thing, comes under a moral system that is perfectly idiosyncratic to him, perfectly peculiar to him. When Gringoire affirms the sovereignty of his whim against the logic of the narrative, when he performs an act of freedom, he indirectly and quite unwillingly becomes a murderer. Some critics seem to really dislike Gringoire and have a perspective at the character that seems too univocal to me. On the contrary, I think that we must see him as holding together the two sides, positive and negative, joyful and sometimes deadly, of utopia. And this is what the novel invites us to do. Thank you very much.
his insight into a character that, as we said, is often overlooked and yet has so much to say and tell us about Hugo's own evolution as a writer. Questions for Jordi then about Pierre Gringoire? Marva.
Thank you. Because I've often wondered what is Pierre Gringoire doing in the novel. So I have many more insights now. What you said makes lots of sense. But you remind me, and I can't give you any quotes, I don't know the novel anywhere near as well as you. But at the last time I read it, at the beginning, there where he's trying to get his play performed, and it's quite silly at times, what he says, what he does, I think the whole scene, I think, is fairly absurd in some ways. I suspected, I just wondered, whether Hugo, right, Hugo is a poet, primarily at that point in his life, very, very famous as a poet. Gringoire is a poet. It seems he's making fun of him, that Hugo is making fun of Gringoire. So I wondered about that. Could one read it that way, at least at the beginning?
Yes, of course, it's possible too. Hugo's perspective on Gringoire is not clear-cut. I think it's ambivalent. Yes, of course. There is also this an auto-ironic dimension.
That's what
Yes, I think so. Yes, I think so.
Making sort of fun of himself?
Yes.
Because he does that in other plays. Hugo does
Yes,
that in
yes,
other
why
places.
not?
Thank
Yes.
you.
I think he's showing how difficult it is to actually put a play on. Nobody ever gives him any peace, and he has it all the time, these interruptions, and
That is a good point.
thinking all these things.
Yes, himself, Hugo. Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. That's very illuminating. The character of Gringoire reminds me of the character of Feste in Shakespeare's Twelfth Night. I don't know whether you know this play.
No,
Here's a man who is both inside the plot and outside at the same time. But Feste is a character who's an entertainer. Basically, he's there he's like your man juggling or carrying chairs with his, doing outrageously silly things to please.
Yeah.
It's just, I offer you that.
Thank you. I don't have any clue on that matter. Maybe if someone in the audience will.
Is there a Shakespearean in the audience? Do we have a Shakespearean?
Not that much, no.
No, but there's definitely an intertext there, certainly. Roy?
It sounds like a fascinating character. Is there a Gringoire in any other Hugo books?
An equivalent of Gringoire in other novels or?
Yeah, similar character.
It's a difficult question and an excellent one. I don't know like that. I can't answer you. I don't see any obvious structural equivalent of Gringoire, but maybe there are some.
Certainly not in terms of the poet-philosopher figure in quite that same way. There are projections of Hugo onto other. I mean, Marius is the obvious one in Les Miserables, but not to the same degree as Jordi's outlined here, I think.
Ursus in L'Homme qui rit, maybe, but it is quite.
That's tiré par les cheveux.
Yes, far-fetched. Ursus has a more important role in the plot of L'Homme qui rit than Gringoire is that of Notre Dame de Paris. So the comparison is not completely convincing, I think, but maybe it's one of the closest example we could find.
I think Nicola had a question as well.
Thank you for doing this, because I've always worried about minor characters in novels, because I always feel as though critics equate their status as minor characters with their being unimportant. And they take just about as much energy to create as the major ones, I think, sometimes more. And I'm fascinated by your discussion about this, and I'm sort of wondering, it sounds like a trivial question, but maybe it isn't. Why do you think he chooses the goat over Esmeralda? Because I think he's kind of thinking the goat won't disappoint him.
I don't know if he will be disappointed. That's what you have said.
Why does he choose to say?
Yeah.
Pourquoi choisir la chèvre?
Yeah, he's very unsensuous. So he's characterized by a fundamental lack of maybe ability to love also. But, sorry, he's also lacked by a certain ability to love. And so he cannot love women. It's au-dessus de ses forces.
It's beyond him.
It's beyond him, yes. But he's quite happy with the goat. And it has to be noted that the union between Gringoire and the goat, as the preface writer of the US edition, Elizabeth McCracken, says, is the only happy marriage in the novel. And it's the only, yes?
It's a real goat, not like in the cartoon we saw just before lunch.
No, it's a real goat. It's a real goat, and Gringoire is very happy with her. And the opposite is true also at the end of the novel when Gringoire and Frollo rescue the goat and the gypsy girl in the cathedral. Jali, the goat, rubs herself against Gringoire's legs, and she's overjoyed when she sees him. So everything is going fine for them.
I think as well there's the biographical reading too, because in this period in Hugo's life there's such a sense of betrayal and uncertainty around the value of any amorous relationship. But obviously with an animal it's a complete departure. I think what was fascinating, Jordi, if I may, about the presentation was that ambiguity you draw out, because the temptation of the easy path is always traced in Hugo's writing, that the strong lure of taking an easy way forward, rather than taking the harder path, just having the escape route. And I think Gringoire really, the union with Jali, I mean, as you say, he doesn't condemn Esmeralda directly, it's indirect, but it makes us as readers look at him as quite irresponsible. And yet in his own mind, all he's doing is, using the American expression, getting out of Dodge. He's getting out of harm's way and taking with him the one character who's not really been offensive.
And when he chooses not to save the Esmeralda, he probably also saved his own life, because if he would have been caught with her, he would have been maybe hanged or something like that.
I think Marty, you
I
have
just
another
was going
question.
to add an answer to Nicola's question. We just can't forget that Esmeralda saved Gringoire by marrying him.
Yes,
and
yes.
then
Yes,
rejected him
oh,
as
yes, of course.
advances as
Yes,
her husband.
yes, it's an important
That's
element. You're right. Yeah,
whatever
you're right.
that means.
But he doesn't feel any moral requirement because she saved him. What's what amazes me about it? She saved him. He can care less.
Right.
So he doesn't. So I think probably most people would do.
But let's not forget as well that Esmeralda is portrayed in a way that, she isn't totally idealised, and that she's so blinded by Phoebus, so completely blinded by him, that as readers you can't help but react somewhat strongly to that and think, for goodness sake, everybody else can see this, you can't. So I think, Hugo, there's a lot of tension there and ambiguity as a narrator towards her as a character, I think. And I think part of that's channeled through Gringoire. Another question over here.
I don't know much about Gringoire, but it's certainly an interesting area to study. Just two thoughts I had was that for possibly the 18th century, most poets and writers, even Shakespeare perhaps, Chaucer, had no social status. And gradually the writer became important, wealthy, a senator, senior. And Hugo kind of makes the poet almost a beggar character, a street character. I don't know, and there's that element to it. And you suggested that the poet wasn't very brave, so that he was hanging back. So maybe there was a degree of self-flagellation there, that writers can only do so much, but when it comes to military success or revolution, maybe they're not quite there.
Actually, Gringoire is, in some sequences of the book, Gringoire is quite brave. He's quite bold. He's not devoid of bravery when he tries to save Esmeralda from Quasimodo without knowing that it is Quasimodo who is attacking her. So, yeah.
But also easily manipulated. I think something that always strikes me about Gringoire is when Frollo
he's manipulated by Frollo
with him, and you can see the trap that Frollo is laying. And again, you think with Gringoire, wake up,
Yeah, and he really thinks that Frollo is on the same side. And that's why in the last sequence, when he goes away with the goat, he's legitimate to think that Frollo will watch over the gypsy girl. He cannot know that he will betray her.
I think we have another question there as well.
very, very interesting. I've never given this character any thought at all. The one beautiful thing about the passage you have up on the board there is that there's something there in the French which is totally missing in the English, unless I'm mistaken, I'm not excellent at French. But ne prit pas la fuite, mais il ne fit point un pas de fuite, which is a sort of total immobilization, such as I don't think I've ever seen in a single sentence. The part comes back in a different sense in this last part of the sentence.
Yes.
Absolutely amazing.
It's
That's where he's totally paralyzed. Il ne prit
Yeah.
pas la fuite.
exactly.
Il ne fit point un pas de fuite.
Yeah, it's translated. Maybe it's a bit under-translated. Gringoire did not run away, neither did he advance another step. It's a translation by Catherine Liu. Maybe it's yes, under.
Complete.
Yes, one final question, I think.
Do you see any parallels with the departure of Gringoire and Jarley at the end, with other couples essentially escaping from Hugo novels? I was thinking in particular of In Toys in the Sea, when Déruchette and Ebenezer Coudray disappear on the boat, leaving behind Juliette's fate.
Yeah.
Or at the end of Les Miserables, we've got essentially
Marius and Cosette.
Cosette leaving behind.
Yeah.
You've got the same thing here with Gringoire and the goat leaving behind.
Yes.
Well, in fact, both Quasimodo and also Esmeralda to their fate. It just struck me as a sort of theme that
Yes.
appeared at the end of a lot of Hugo novels.
Yes, you're right, and I think that one of the main problems one of the main issues for Hugo is that history must go on. So he needs some characters who survive and who are happy together and marry. So in many novels by him, the main characters die, but there are also some characters who escape, who save their skin, who go away, so that history can continue. So I think that's the reason why there is such a pattern in different works by him.
And all those examples, those relationships, are all they're not very complex relationships. The two lovers in Les Miserables, also in Tour de Sea, it's quite sort of simplistically depicted. They're not very complicated relationships, and the same with the goat and Gringoire, as you just described. I just found that interesting as well, that the surviving relationships are not the ones that involve complexity.
Yes.
They're also quite, I think the ambiguity you've drawn out with Gringoire, we can see that to Marius and Cosette. There is ambiguity as to whether they'll be able to really pick up the mantle that Jean Valjean has left for them. Similarly with Déruchette, there's a superficiality to her tastes. So the people who survive Hugo novels aren't necessarily the absolute guarantors of a better future. It's left very much open-ended. And I think that your reading here of Gringoire really reinforces that understanding.
And the more interesting characters, who are also the sublime and or the grotesque ones, are often condemned to die, because they are sublime and grotesque, and they are implicated in the violence and of the violence of history.